My name is Clara Whitfield. I am 39 years old. And the moment I need to tell you about happened on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like instant coffee and carpet cleaner, when a man I had trusted with more of myself than I had ever intended looked across a table at me and said, with complete and practiced calm, that I was being unreasonable. Not angry. Not defensive. Calm. That was the part that stayed with me longest, not the word itself, but the tone it arrived in. The tone of someone who had already decided the conversation was over before it began. The tone of someone who understood, in a way I had not yet fully grasped, that he held the authority in the room and that authority, in that moment, was the only currency that mattered. I had driven 40 minutes to that meeting. I had prepared for it for 3 days. I had written notes in the small green notebook I carried everywhere, bullet points, specific dates, the exact language that had been used in the incidents I was raising. I had done everything right, the way you do everything right when you are trying to be taken seriously, when you understand instinctively that a woman raising a concern about how she has been treated must arrive with evidence and precision and composure or she will not be heard. I arrived with all of those things. It did not matter. The conference room had 6 chairs around the table, but only 3 of us were there, me, him, and a woman named Sandra who was his deputy and who spent most of the meeting looking at a point slightly to the left of my face. The overhead light was the kind that hums. I noticed it because in the silences, and there were many silences, the hum was the loudest thing in the room. His name was Robert Ashby. He was 53 years old, the regional director of the volunteer organization where I had given 3 years of my time, my energy, and more of my private self than I now know was wise. He had kind eyes. He had always had kind eyes. That was one of the first things I had noticed about him when we met, the specific warmth of his gaze when he was listening to you, the way he made you feel, in those early months, like what you were saying was the most important thing being said anywhere. I had trusted those eyes completely. I looked at them now across the conference table and I tried to find what I had trusted in them and I could not find it, and I thought, is it gone? Or was it never there? And I thought, does it matter? And I thought, yes. It matters. It matters enormously. Because the answer changes everything about the last 3 years. He said, Clara, I think you're reading this situation in a way that's not entirely. Look, I hear you, I do, but I think you might be taking this more personally than the situation warrants. I said, it happened to me. How else would I take it? He looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at the wall. And that exchange, those 2 sentences, that glance, that wall, contained everything I had not been able to name for the last 6 months. But to understand why that conference room broke something in me that has taken years to fully repair, I have to take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning was not a warning. The beginning was the warmest thing I had felt in a long time. And that is exactly what made the ending so hard to survive. I joined the volunteer organization 7 years ago, in the autumn after my marriage ended. Not dramatically ended. It ended the way some marriages end, with a long, quiet diminishment, a slow withdrawal of warmth until what remained was 2 people sharing a house in a way that had stopped resembling partnership and started resembling cohabitation, and then one conversation on a Sunday evening that said out loud what both of us had known for about a year. We had been married for 6 years. We did not have children. The ending was sad in a specific, undramatic way that is in some ways harder to process than the explosive endings, because there is no clear villain, no single moment to point to, no narrative permission to fall completely apart. I fell quietly apart instead. Over about 8 months. The organization was something a friend suggested. She had been a volunteer there for 2 years and she said what she always said when she thought I needed something to do with my hands. Come try it. You can leave if it's not for you. And she was right. She was always right about these things. because I went once on a Tuesday evening and I did not leave for 3 years. It was a community outreach organization, practical, unglamorous work. Connecting people who needed things with people who could provide them. Food. Housing referrals. Benefit navigation. The work required patience and a certain kind of attention, the ability to listen to someone who was frightened or overwhelmed and help them feel heard before you helped them solve anything. I was, it turned out, good at this. Better than I had expected to be. And finding something you are good at, after a period of feeling like you are not quite succeeding at anything, is a very specific kind of relief. Robert ran the regional office. He had been with the organization for 11 years. He was the kind of leader who remembered names, not just volunteers' names, but the names of the people the volunteers served, details from conversations months earlier, the specific texture of each person's situation. He had a way of making you feel, in a room full of people, like you were also somehow having a private conversation. It was a genuine skill and I admired it without reservation. We began to talk more after my 3rd month. Not formally, there was no arrangement, no deliberate building of a connection. It simply developed the way some connections do, organically and in the margins of other things. A conversation after a briefing that ran long. A shared observation about a particularly difficult case. A joke that landed in the specific way jokes land when 2 people find the same things funny. He read. That was the thing that opened it, if I'm honest. I mentioned a book I had just finished, a novel, literary fiction, the kind that requires patience but rewards it, and his face changed. Not dramatically. Just, he became slightly more present, which I had not thought was possible because he was already very present. He said, that book wrecked me when I was 35. Just that. And I thought, there you are. We started lending each other books. A small thing, practically speaking. Meaningful in a way that went beyond books. There is a particular intimacy in recommending something you love. You are not just suggesting a book, you are saying, this is something that matters to me, I think it might matter to you, I trust you with it. I trusted him with it. Over the following year, the connection deepened in the way of things that are built incrementally, almost without your noticing until you look back and understand how much architecture has been constructed. We shared things. Not confessional things. I want to be precise about this, because imprecision here would be unfair to the truth. We shared values, perspectives, humor, the specific kind of professional trust that develops between people who are working toward the same thing and respect how the other person works toward it. He knew about my marriage ending, not in detail but in outline. I knew about his. He was divorced, had been for 4 years, had a daughter at university in Edinburgh whom he spoke about with a quiet pride that I found touching. We had a standing Thursday coffee. Informal. Not scheduled into any system. Just, understood. After the Thursday evening volunteer briefing, while others packed up and said their goodbyes, we would make tea from the organization's somewhat ancient kettle and sit at the table in the small back office and talk for 40 minutes or so. About the work. About books. About the larger questions the work kept raising, about what people actually need versus what they ask for, about the specific loneliness of people who have fallen through every available net. Those Thursdays were one of the things I looked forward to most in my week. I want you to understand that. Not as a confession of romantic feeling, it was not that, or not only that, or not in a simple clear-cut way that would make this story easier. I want you to understand it because that level of anticipation, that level of value placed on a connection, is the measure of what I eventually lost. And loss only makes sense when you understand what was there. What was there was real. I am certain of that, even now. It was not imagined. It was not one-sided. It was a genuine connection between 2 people who found each other interesting and worth the time, and who built something in the margins of volunteer work and Thursday evenings that mattered. I did not know, then, what it would cost me to have cared about it. The first thing I noticed was so small that I almost didn't notice it at all. It was a Thursday evening in February, about 14 months into the connection. We were in the back office, tea made, the usual. I had raised something that week, a situation with another volunteer, a man named Gary, who had made a comment to me during a shift that had been dismissive in a way I found difficult to shake. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that has a clear name. The kind of comment that lands and then sits in you, and you keep turning it over, and you keep thinking, was that what I think it was? I told Robert about it. Not formally. Not as a complaint. The way you tell someone you trust about something that is bothering you, in the way of, I want to understand this, help me think through it. He listened. He nodded. He said, Gary's like that with everyone. It's just his manner. You know how he is. I said, yes, but it landed differently for me than I think he meant it to. He said, he doesn't mean anything by it. It's just banter. And then the conversation moved on. I sat with the word banter for a long time afterward. Not because the incident itself was large. Because of what banter meant, as a response to what I had said. It meant, your experience of this is incorrect. It meant, the way this landed for you is not the way it should have landed. It meant, the problem is your interpretation, not his behavior. I did not say any of this out loud. I filed it in the back of my mind and moved on. The second thing was 3 months later. A different situation, not Gary, a process issue, something related to how a complaint another volunteer had raised was being handled. I was on the volunteer committee that was supposed to oversee these things, and I had concerns about the timeline. The volunteer had been waiting 6 weeks for a response that the policy said should take 2. I raised this at a committee meeting. Robert was running the meeting. He acknowledged my concern. He said the delay was due to capacity pressures. He said he appreciated me flagging it. He said they would aim to move it forward. Nothing changed. 3 weeks later, at the next committee meeting, I raised it again. And this time something was different in the room. Something in the quality of Robert's attention when I spoke. Not hostile. Slightly managed. The way someone manages their response to something they find mildly inconvenient. He said, Clara, I think we need to trust the process here. These things take time. I said, the process says 2 weeks. It's been 9. He said, yes, and I've explained the context for that. He moved to the next item. I looked around the table. 3 other committee members were looking at their papers. Sandra, who was also in the meeting, was writing something in her notepad. I thought, did that just happen the way I think it happened? And then I thought, maybe I am being too precise about the timeline. Maybe 9 weeks in context is reasonable. Maybe the process allows for interpretation. I talked myself out of what I had just seen in about 45 seconds. This is, I now understand, a skill I had been practicing my whole life. The rapid conversion of evidence into doubt. The almost instantaneous translation of what my eyes and gut were telling me into a more generous and less uncomfortable interpretation. I was very good at it. I had been very good at it for years. And I had never noticed I was doing it, because it happened so fast and so automatically that it did not feel like a choice. The Thursday coffees continued. That was the thing that made everything harder to see. Between the moments that troubled me, the warmth continued. The books continued. The conversations about the work and the larger questions it raised continued. The Robert who listened and understood and made you feel heard. He was still there, in the back office on Thursday evenings, and I still looked forward to those hours and valued them and considered them among the genuine good things in my life. And because that warmth continued, I kept applying it to the other moments. I kept using it as evidence against my own discomfort. I kept thinking, this man cares about me. He has shown me that he cares. Therefore the moments where I felt dismissed must be something I am misreading. Therefore I am the problem. Therefore I should adjust. I adjusted. I adjusted for 6 more months. And then a situation arose that I could not adjust around, no matter how fast I converted it, because it involved my safety. And when I raised it, formally, this time, in writing, because I had finally understood that informal conversations were disappearing into his generous non-response, what came back to me was not care. Was not urgency. Was not the warmth I had built a belief in over 2 years. What came back was process. And patience. And, Clara, I think you might be taking this more personally than the situation warrants. I want to take you into that conference room in real time now, because the details of it matter, and because I have replayed them so many times that I can give them to you with complete precision. I arrived at 2:57 p.m. for a 3 o'clock meeting. The building was the organization's regional office, a converted terraced house on a quiet street, the kind of building that had been functional for too long without renovation, everything slightly worn in a way that was almost charming. I had been in that building dozens of times. I knew which floorboard creaked at the top of the stairs. I knew the specific sound the front door made when it closed. I sat in the reception area for 4 minutes before Sandra came to collect me. She said hello. She asked if I wanted water. She led me to the conference room. She was professional and neutral in a way that told me she had been briefed. That was the first thing that landed. She had been briefed on me. On what I was coming to say. On how to manage it. I sat down. Robert came in 2 minutes later. He was wearing a blue shirt I had seen him in before. He said my name. He smiled. It was the smile I knew, not warm this time, or not only warm, but also managed. Contained. The smile of someone who has already decided what this meeting is. He sat down. Sandra sat beside him. I sat across. He said, "Is so. Clara, tell me what's on your mind." As if I had requested the meeting for unspecified reasons. As if the formal written complaint I had submitted 14 days ago, the one that had taken me 3 drafts and 2 conversations with a friend who worked in HR to get right, as if that did not exist and had not defined the entire purpose of this room. I said, I'm here to follow up on my formal complaint. The one I submitted on the 14th. He said, yes, absolutely, and we appreciate you putting that in writing. I just want to create some space first for us to talk, informally, openly, before we go into the formal process. Informal. Again. I thought, this is a technique. I know this technique. This is the technique of making the formal informal, of creating a context where what is said cannot be referenced against anything, of softening the edges of accountability before they can cut. I said, I prefer to stay within the formal process, if that's okay. That's why I wrote to you. He nodded. He said of course. He said he completely understood. And then he spent the next 12 minutes doing exactly what he had said he wasn't going to do, talking around the complaint, contextualizing it, explaining the pressures the organization was under, describing the complexity of the situation I had reported, acknowledging in general terms that things could always be improved while making it entirely clear that nothing I had described was going to result in any specific action. I let him finish. I had decided, before the meeting, that I would let him finish. That I would not interrupt. That I would wait. When he stopped speaking, I opened my green notebook. I said, on the 7th of September, at approximately 7:15 p.m., during the Tuesday evening shift, the following incident occurred. And I read what I had written. Dates. Specific language. The exact words that had been used by the other person in the incident that had triggered the complaint. The exact words I had used in response. What had happened after. When I finished, I looked up. Robert said, I hear you. And I want you to know that I take what you're saying seriously. The hum of the overhead light. Sandra looking at the wall. He said, but I think, and I say this with real care for you, Clara, I think you might be reading this situation in a way that's not entirely. Look, I hear you, I do, but I think you might be taking this more personally than the situation warrants. I said, it happened to me. How else would I take it? He looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at the wall. I sat very still. Outside, a car passed on the quiet street. The overhead light hummed. My hands were flat on the table because I had placed them there deliberately, the way you place your hands deliberately when you need something to be deliberate. And I thought, I drove 40 minutes for this. I drafted this complaint 3 times. I have been patient for 6 months and careful for 2 years, and I trusted this man with things that mattered, and he is looking at his deputy and she is looking at the wall, and he just told me I am taking my own experience too personally. I thought, there it is. Not the worst thing anyone has ever said to me. Not even close. But it was the moment where the last remaining explanation, the one that said, he cares, he just doesn't always show it perfectly, you know who he is underneath this, that explanation simply stopped being available. I closed my green notebook. I said, I'd like a written response to my formal complaint within the timescale specified in the policy. He said, of course. I said, thank you for your time. I stood up. I picked up my notebook and my bag, and I walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and out of the front door, and I stood on the pavement outside for about 30 seconds while the autumn afternoon held itself very still around me. And then I walked to my car. And I sat in it for 8 minutes before I could drive. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story is reaching you, if any part of it sounds like something you have lived through, please like and subscribe. It only takes a second and it means everything to me. Drop a comment with your location and your local time right now. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to those first days after I walked out of that building. The immediate aftermath had a strange quality to it. I had expected to feel broken. What I felt instead, in the first 24 hours, was something closer to clarity. A terrible, clean clarity, the kind that arrives after something you have been refusing to see finally becomes impossible to not see. I drove home from that meeting with the radio off, the 40 minutes of motorway unreeling in silence, and I thought about the last 2 years with a directness I had not allowed myself before. I thought about the Thursday coffees. Not with bitterness, with something more complicated. A kind of inventory. What had been real and what had been the story I was telling about what was real. Those things were not identical. I was only now beginning to understand the gap between them. I called my friend Priya that evening. Not to explain everything. I didn't have the words for everything yet. I said, I think I've been misreading something for a long time and I've just stopped being able to. She said, okay. Come over. I said, I'm fine, I just needed to tell someone. She said, come over anyway. I went. We sat in her kitchen until 11, and she did not tell me what I should feel or what I should do. She just witnessed. She let me talk myself through it. That is, I have come to understand, one of the most valuable things another person can do for you. Not solve it, not interpret it, just stay in the room while you find your own way to the thing you need to say. The formal written response arrived 17 days later. 14 days beyond the policy deadline. It was 3 paragraphs. It acknowledged my complaint. It explained that a review had taken place. It concluded that the concerns I had raised, while noted, did not constitute a breach of the organization's policies. It thanked me for my contribution to the organization and expressed hope that I would continue to be involved. I read it once. Then I put it in a folder. I did not return to volunteer. Not because I made a dramatic decision not to, just because the next Tuesday came and I did not go, and then the one after that, and at some point I understood that the choice had already been made, quietly, somewhere below the level of formal decision. The work I had loved, the actual work, the connecting people with what they needed, the patience of it, the attention it required, I missed that. I missed it genuinely and specifically, in the way you miss something that suited you. But the building, the Thursday evenings, the back office, the kettle, the 40 minutes of conversation, those things I could not return to. They had become something else. The still moment came on a Thursday at 8 o'clock in the evening. I was at home, making dinner. The specific time registered before anything else, 8 o'clock on a Thursday. The exact hour when, for over a year, I would have been in the back office with tea I had made from the ancient kettle, talking about books and the work and the larger questions it raised with a man I trusted. For over a year, that hour on that day had belonged to something. Now it belonged to me making pasta alone in my own kitchen. And the difference between those two things, the weight of that difference, landed in a way that dinner could not quite absorb. I turned off the radio. I finished making the pasta. I ate it at my kitchen table and I looked at the window and I thought, I am allowed to grieve this. Even if from the outside it looks like just a professional conflict. I am allowed. Rock bottom did not arrive as an event. It arrived as a season, and the season lasted about 6 weeks. The replaying was the worst of it. Not the incident in the conference room. Oddly, that one I could hold at a slight distance, because it was clear. I knew what had happened there and I knew how to feel about it. What I could not hold at a distance was everything before it. All the Thursdays. All the books. All the conversations where I had felt genuinely known by someone and had believed that feeling was earned and mutual and safe. I kept returning to specific moments and turning them over, examining them with the harsh light of what I now knew, trying to determine which parts had been real and which parts had been my own need for connection filling in a shape that wasn't actually there. That process is its own particular cruelty. Because you cannot know. You can never fully know. The warmth felt real from the inside, and from the inside is the only place you have access to. You cannot reach back through time and strip away your own experience and look at it from the outside. You can only hold both things. The warmth felt real, and the conference room also happened. Both are true. Sitting with both, without resolving them into a single clean story, is one of the hardest things I have ever done. I woke up at 3 a.m. more nights than I can count. Not from nightmares. Just awake. In the specific alertness of a brain that has unfinished business and insists on working through it in the dark when there are no other distractions. I would lie there and replay. Not always the conference room. Often something smaller. The way he had said, in a Thursday coffee, maybe 18 months in, you see things that other people miss. A simple sentence. Something I had stored and valued. And I would lie there at 3 a.m. and think, what did he mean by that? Did he mean it? And then, does it matter if he meant it? And then, of course it matters. Of course it matters whether things are meant. I had a friend, a woman I had known since university, a woman named Helen who had moved to Edinburgh and whom I spoke to irregularly but always with a feeling of picking up something that had never been put down, and I called her one evening in week 4. Late. Too late, probably. She answered. I said, I trusted someone and it turned out they weren't who I thought they were. And I'm struggling with whether that means the connection wasn't real or whether it means real connections can contain people who are also capable of letting you down in ways that undo the connection. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, why does it have to be one or the other? I lay on my bedroom floor after that call. Not dramatically. I had moved there at some point because the floor felt more solid than the bed, which is a thing I do sometimes when the weight of something is particularly heavy, the specific animal comfort of having the ground beneath you. The room was dark. Outside my window, the street was very quiet for a city. Someone walked past. I could hear footsteps, the rhythm of them, and then they were gone. I held a book in my hands. Not reading it. Just holding it. It was one of the books Robert had lent me. I had never returned it. It had simply migrated into my shelf and stayed there. I had not thought about it until this moment. I ran my thumb over the cover and I thought, I don't even like this book as much as he said I would. I thought I liked it because he liked it. I wanted to like the same things. I set it down on the floor beside me. The room was completely still. No traffic outside. No sounds from the neighbors. Just the dark and the silence and the specific weight of understanding something you wished you could understand. I stayed on the floor for a long time. If you have ever trusted someone in a position of authority or care, someone who had real power over your experience, and found that when it mattered most, they chose their comfort and their role over your dignity, tell me in the comments. How did you make sense of it? What did you do on the nights when the replaying wouldn't stop? I want to know. And if you are still here with me, hit that like button. Because the next part is where the ground starts to feel solid again. The war inside me had 2 fronts and they were fighting against each other constantly. The first front was the anger. And I want to be honest about the anger, because I spent a long time not being honest about it, dismissing it, qualifying it, telling myself it wasn't proportionate, that nothing dramatic had happened, that objectively speaking this was just a professional disappointment and people had those all the time and you didn't get to be furious about professional disappointments. That was not true. I was allowed to be furious. And the fury, when I finally let myself feel it without the qualifier, was clarifying. It was the specific fury of someone who had given real attention and real care to a connection and had it repaid, at the moment of her greatest need for it to be honored, with the language of bureaucracy and the look that went to the deputy and the carefully managed warmth of a man who had decided that his role mattered more than her experience. That is something to be furious about. I was furious about it for weeks. The second front was the grief. And the grief was harder than the fury because grief has no object to push against. Fury has somewhere to go. Grief just stays. It sits in you and makes everything slightly heavier and does not respond to argument or evidence or the very reasonable point that 3 years of connection, even if it ended badly, even if it was not entirely what it appeared to be, did not constitute a relationship significant enough to grieve in the way I was grieving it. My therapist, I had returned to seeing a woman named Dr. Fiona Greaves who I had seen briefly in the years after my marriage ended and who I called in week 3 because I was not sleeping and the replaying was not stopping. She said something in one of our early sessions that I have thought about almost every week since. She said, "You're allowed to grieve the idea of who you thought he was." I sat with that for a long time. I nearly emailed him twice. I had drafted both emails in the Notes app on my phone at 2 or 3 in the morning, which tells you something about the state I was drafting them in. The first email was angry, not unreasonably angry, but angry in a way that I knew, even at 3 a.m., would not be received as I needed it to be received, and would give him a basis for the thing he most wanted to be true about me, which was that I was not being entirely reasonable. I deleted it. The second email was different. Quieter. It said, more or less, I want to understand how you can be both people. How the man who talked with me about what people actually need can also be the man who told me I was taking my own experience too personally. I want to understand whether you know. Whether it ever crossed your mind. I did not send that one either. Not because it was wrong. Because I understood, finally, that I was not going to get an answer that helped me. Whatever he would say in response, defensive, apologetic, somewhere in between, none of it would give me what I actually needed, which was not his explanation but my own. My own understanding of how this had happened and what it meant and what I was going to do with it. The small conscious choice I made was on a Saturday morning in December, 8 weeks after the conference room. I went for a walk, a specific walk, to a specific canal path near my house that I had been walking for years, in all weathers, for all the kinds of thinking that require moving. And I made a decision that I did not tell anyone about because it was a private decision, between me and myself. I decided to stop trying to reconcile the two versions of him. I decided that the warmth had been real and the conference room had also been real, and these two things did not cancel each other out. They were both true, simultaneously, of the same person. And that I did not need to resolve that contradiction. I could simply hold it, carry it without resolution, and move forward with the knowledge it gave me. I walked the whole length of the canal and back. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. When I got home, I made tea. And for the first time in 8 weeks, I did not think about the conference room while I made it. The turning point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. I had started, in the months after leaving the organization, doing some independent volunteer work, not through any organization, just direct community connection, the kind of thing that does not require a structure or a hierarchy or a regional director or a conference room. A neighbor who needed help with benefit applications. A woman at my church who was navigating a difficult housing situation. Small things. The actual work, stripped of all the apparatus that had surrounded it. I was helping my neighbor, a woman named Margaret, 71 years old, clear-eyed and funny and absolutely impatient with anything that wasted her time, navigate a particularly complex benefit appeal. We had been working through it for 3 weeks. The paperwork was considerable. The language it was written in was deliberately obscure in the way that benefit paperwork always is, as if the complexity itself is part of the gatekeeping. We had submitted the appeal on a Friday. On the Tuesday, 12 days after I had walked away from the canal and decided to stop trying to reconcile the irreconcilable, the decision came back. The appeal had been upheld. Margaret was owed 14 months of backdated payments, a total of £4,200. She looked at the letter for a long time. Then she looked at me. Then she said, and this is the thing that shifted something, she said, I want you to know that you are very good at this. Not just at the forms. At making people feel like their thing matters. I said, it does matter. She said, yes. But not everyone makes you feel that it does. I drove home from Margaret's flat and I sat in my car outside my own house for a while, the engine off, the November afternoon going dark around me. And I thought about what she had said. Not the compliment. I did not sit there feeling proud of myself. That is not what it was. I sat there thinking about the specific phrase, making people feel like their thing matters. I thought about how that had been, all along, the thing I was actually trying to do. In the organization, in the work, in the Thursday coffees, in the trust one had extended and the care I had invested. I had been trying, in all of it, to make things matter in the way they deserved to matter. And I had chosen, at some point, to invest that effort in a man who ultimately did not give it back when it was mine that needed mattering. That was not stupidity. That was not naivety. That was me doing what I do, with someone who could not fully meet it. That distinction between what I brought and what he was capable of felt, for the first time, like ground. The tide had turned. Not dramatically. Not with a declaration. Just, the ground was there, and I was standing on it. The karma, when it came quietly and from a direction I had not anticipated. 6 months after the conference room, I received an email from a woman named Dr. Judith Waller. She was a researcher at a university several hours from where I lived, working on a project examining governance and accountability structures in volunteer organizations, specifically looking at how formal complaint processes functioned in practice versus how they were designed on paper. She had been given my name by someone I had not expected, Helen, my friend in Edinburgh, who was connected to the university through her own work and who had mentioned, during one of our calls, that I had recent direct experience of this exact phenomenon. Dr. Waller wanted to interview me. She was clear about the parameters. My experience would be anonymized. I could review anything before it was used. I could withdraw at any time. She said she had been researching this area for 3 years and that the gap between formal policy and lived experience was, in her findings, almost universal, and almost universally in the same direction. I said yes. The interview lasted 2 hours. I told her, in detail and with the precision I had developed over 6 months of replaying, exactly what had happened. The complaint. The timeline. The conference room. The specific language used. The look that went to the deputy. The wall Sandra had found so interesting. Dr. Waller asked questions that were the best questions I had been asked about any of it, not sympathetic in a way that bent the account, but rigorous, in a way that required me to be precise and honest about what I knew versus what I was inferring. At the end, she said, what you're describing is a pattern we see repeatedly. The informal conversation that precedes and undermines the formal process. The reframing of a woman's specific concern as a general emotional state. The use of procedural language to create a conclusion that was decided before the meeting began. This is textbook. Textbook. Not imagined. Not personal. Not me taking something more personally than it warranted. A pattern. Recognized. Named. I drove home from that interview with a feeling I did not have a word for. Not vindication exactly. Vindication requires an audience and a declaration, and this had neither. Something quieter. The feeling of having a thing you already knew confirmed by someone with no stake in confirming it. The specific, small, important piece of being told, you were not wrong. Dr. Waller's research was published 14 months later, a peer-reviewed paper in a journal I had to look up to understand the significance of, but whose significance I grasped quickly once I did. The paper described, in the careful language of academic research, the exact patterns I had experienced. It was cited, within 6 months of publication, in a national review of volunteer sector governance that was being conducted by a parliamentary committee. My experience, anonymized, precise, contributed in a 2-hour interview in a university meeting room, was part of something that mattered beyond me. Robert Ashby, as I learned from someone who remained connected to the organization, stepped down from his regional director position 8 months after the paper was published. Not because of anything directly traceable to me, the reasons were described, publicly, as personal. But the timing sat inside the larger context in a way I noticed and did not comment on. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, tired. Tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something for longer than was good for them and has finally been able to set it down. The last time I saw Robert was not in person. It was an email, 8 months after the conference room. He wrote to thank me for my contribution to the organization. He said he hoped I was well. He said, and I read this 3 times, that he had been doing some thinking about how he had handled certain situations and that he was aware he had not always gotten it right. He did not name anything specifically. He did not say the word complaint. He did not say conference room or unreasonable or banter. He said, not always gotten it right. I read it at my kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with a cup of tea that was slightly too hot to drink yet. I read it and I sat with it and I thought, is this an apology? It is not an apology. It is the outline of an apology. The approximate shape of one. The thing you say when you need to have said something and you are not quite ready to say the thing itself. I thought about whether to respond. I thought about this for 4 days. Then I wrote back, a thank you for your message. I'm well. I hope you are too. And I sent it. Not warm. Not cold. Honest. The exact temperature of where I was. I have not heard from him since. I do not expect to. The organization, as I understand it, is still running. The work continues. People are still connected with what they need. That is a good thing. The work was always a good thing. The work was not the problem. If you liked how this ended, not with a confrontation, not with a breakdown, but with a woman who finally stopped asking whether the warmth was real and started asking what she was going to do with everything she now knew, then subscribe and check the description. I have more stories just like this one waiting for you. Now let me tell you the last thing. I want to speak to you directly. Not as narrator to audience, but as one woman to another, the way you speak when the recording has stopped and it's just 2 people at a table with the last of a cup of tea going cold. What I want to say is this: the caring was not the mistake. I know that is not the obvious lesson. The obvious lesson, the one I told myself for months in the form of a criticism, is that I should not have cared so much, should not have trusted so deeply, should not have allowed a professional relationship to become something I valued in a way that left me vulnerable. That lesson is wrong. Or it is not the most useful version of the truth. The most useful version is, caring is not the risk. Caring is one of the more valuable things you can do with your time on earth. The risk is in not knowing, or not being willing to know, when the person you are caring about does not have the capacity to care for you with the same quality of attention. That is the gap. Not your caring. Their capacity. I think about the Thursday coffees. The books. The conversation in the back office about what people actually need versus what they ask for. I think about the warmth in those hours, which was, I have decided, finally and without apology, real. I think about the version of Robert who recommended the novel that wrecked him at 35 and the version of Robert who looked at Sandra while I sat across the conference table, and I understand now that these are not 2 different people. They are the same person. A person who was genuinely curious and genuinely warm and also, when his authority and comfort were threatened, genuinely capable of choosing those things over the dignity of someone who trusted him. People are not simplified by our disappointment in them. That is the hardest thing I have learned from any of this. The warmth does not cancel the conference room. The conference room does not cancel the warmth. A person can be both, and often is, and your caring for the first version does not obligate you to accept the second. You are allowed to grieve the idea of who you thought someone was. That is a legitimate loss. It is not dramatic. It does not require a public accounting. It is just real. And naming it as real, without apologizing for its existence, is the beginning of being able to put it down. I walk the canal path most Saturdays now. In all weathers. For all the kinds of thinking that require moving. Last autumn, a Saturday in October, almost exactly 2 years after the conference room, I walked the whole length of it and back and I did not think about Robert Ashby once. Not once in 2 hours and 20 minutes. I noticed this when I got home. I made tea. I thought, there it is. Not recovery in the sense of returning to what I was before. I am not what I was before. What I am is someone who has carried a specific and complicated thing for a specific amount of time and set it down with intention and kept walking. That is enough. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Caring for the wrong person does not make you foolish. It makes you someone who cared. There is a difference.